when I started to eat healthy, I felt like my brain turned on for the first time in my entire life. You're gonna die. That's the agreement. Like, you're born and you're gonna die. One of the laws of the universe is that energy is constantly in motion.
Mark, first of all, thank you for coming, man. And I want to start with some sort of introduction to you, but I don't want to have like the usual introduction. I want to get deep into your story and into all your journey to then like talk a little bit more about your future and also to share lessons to people listening that can help them, especially with social anxiety, which I know you focus much on, and with mental health. And so, doing some research about you just to be a little more prepared for the conversation, I came into your website and I saw that you come from an immigrant family from Egypt. Is that right?
Yeah.
And then just a couple of things I want to read from my notes to give some context to the audience to then like let you dive deep into this part of your life, into your childhood. And so in 2004, you were experimenting with entrepreneurship. So you have been an entrepreneur from a young age. Then in
Yeah.
2007, you moved schools and faced racism and bullying, which I think will be like a big part of today's conversation. Then you also began to develop autoimmune diseases and social anxiety. And then in 2008, you went into the internet and began creating ventures and like websites and apps, but that was during the 2008 crisis, and I think that's interesting, and I would like you to talk a little about that. And finally, I think this was sort of your last year of childhood, and in 2010 you started a YouTube channel about video games with 35,000 subscribers, and I think that's quite fun because having developed social anxiety problems, it's like sort of counterintuitive to learn that you had a channel with 35,000 subscribers. So I would just like you to like guide us through
Yeah.
this stage of your life.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because a lot of the times people who have social anxiety and in real life, they don't really have any friends. They're not really that social. The reality is like being social, it's like a very necessary part of life. Like, you can't skip that part.
Hmm.
And so a lot of the times, like, that need is still there. And so they just try to get it through something else. And a lot of the times, like especially today, because of the internet and social media, you can do that. And so yeah, for me, I remember growing up, and I just had like a fun childhood. And I remember when I was in second grade, moving into third grade in school, I remember my parents and we moved from the inner city in America, which is, more people, more diversity, all kinds of things. And we moved to a small town in America with like 5,000, 6,000 people. And the really interesting part about this town was that I was me and maybe a few other people, we're like the only people who look different, physically speaking, than everybody else. And so I just like remember being a kid and then just all of a sudden, facing like racism and bullying and people abusing me because of how I looked. And so that was like the start of just like my brain. Really what I would say is like my brain breaking. And a lot of people, when it comes to like mental health, the reason why it's hard to talk about is because if you break your leg, you can see that you break your leg, right? And you go to the doctor, right? You go to the doctor, and then he or she gives you some kind of like a cast. They give you crutches so you can stand on it, right? And then they're like, okay, come back in like a month, if you've ever broken your leg, and then they give you a different kind of
Hmm.
cast, right? And then it's like a transition, right? And so a lot of the times in life, especially when we're at an early age as kids, that is where a lot of our brain is just learning things new for the first time. And if you are young and you experience something that you just don't know what to do with, you don't know how to deal with it, a lot of the times what happens is it's almost like your brain fractures, right? It's similar to like breaking your leg,
Hmm.
right? And so what happens is when your brain breaks, when it fractures, a lot of the times because other people don't know that, you can't see it. A lot of the times it's very often ignored. Okay. And the issue with that is when you ignore the issue, what it is like you're not giving somebody the casts and the crutches.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the times they're a kid and then all of a sudden they're just going through life. This thing happens. A lot of times you actually don't even realize it. You don't even realize it happens to you. You know, there's this quote that says, when you're in the picture, you can't see the frame. You know, and like you ever heard of the story Pinocchio, like the Disney movie?
Yeah.
You know, and then like there's this boy and he has the nose and then like his consciousness, which is like the voice in your head that talks to you and decides what's wrong, what's right, that's described by a cricket in the movie. And in the movie, every place the boy goes, he experiences things, and then the cricket always comes running behind him because the cricket is late. And so that's meant to show like a message in life of like, whenever you experience something, your consciousness, which is like your thinking about it, it is always delayed. And so a lot of times you experience things and you don't actually know you're experiencing them, or you don't know how they connect. And so a lot of the times you'll be a kid and you'll experience something that you don't know what to do. That is, when you experience something like that, all of a sudden you feel like a lot of emotions come up. And when we feel a lot of emotions, especially depending on our culture, depending on our religion, depending on our parents, a lot of the times our first instinct is to try to pretend that what happened didn't happen. And a lot of the times, like especially with social anxiety, someone will go through like a traumatic event, like for me, like racism, bullying, and your brain breaks. And then what happens is you try to hide that problem to everybody. You try to hide it with your friends, your family, people who are close to you. And so what happens is nobody ever gives you the crutches, the cast, what's necessary, you know, similar to what I said if you break your leg. And so what happens as an end result is you become 18, 19, 20, and you start to grow up. And then all of a sudden you start to realize different problems and different issues. And a lot of the times, maybe some of those problems happen to you, but a lot of times those problems have actually been there for a long time. And so when I was like experiencing my life, and I was like, you know, kind of growing up, and I was kind of like diving into these internet ventures that you talked about in 2008 and 2010. I remember in 2013, one of my ventures, which was a Minecraft server, became very, very, very successful. And I remember making like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And really just, and I remember, you know, growing up poor and my parents getting government assistance and all this stuff. And all of a sudden I have enough money to do whatever I want in the world. But what happened was that I actually got more depressed and I actually got more anxious. And that's a lot of times what happens. And it's because I never knew what mental health was. I never knew that you had to put on the cast and you had to put on the crutches and you had to give yourself the medicine in different ways. And so that's something that I see it's very common, especially in young people, especially like when you become successful and you start facing more success, is that you realize you're like, oh crap, I'm still the same person. Like nothing actually about my life has changed. And so when that happens, some people get more depressed, they get more hopeless. And for example, like for me, when I was 18, I just sort of didn't know what to do in life and my brain really felt broken. And next thing I knew, you know, I started to eat a lot of food to deal with my emotions. Next thing I knew, I was obese. I started to drink alcohol. I got depressed for the first time. I got, you know, my social anxiety that I had my entire life transformed into social isolation. And then eventually I was suicidal and I wanted to kill myself for about a month. And so I saw this whole process sort of happen. And I was still, you know, like rich. I still had money. But what I do is like nobody ever taught me how to actually use my brain. Nobody actually ever taught me what mental health was. And so I kind of like that was my life and that's what I experienced. And it really wasn't until I began to learn these skills and different things to where I really began to feel like who I was and be comfortable in my own skin and not be afraid of other people's opinions and not be so nervous all the time and just feel good about life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does. What do you think is like the difference between self-help and personal
Mm,
development? Because here I have like, well, one main perspective, which is like with these things that happen and then which break our brain, or yeah, just our reality as we perceive it, we might not be able to heal and those breaks that happen in our brain ever, but still we can like maybe forgive ourselves for going through that. And in the other side of the spectrum, we have like personal development, which is like to, once being kind of healed, improve really, and just be like greater in what you are. It's like the difference between going from bad to good and then from good to great. Do you think that this
mm.
process of like forgiving yourself and the acknowledging all these problems that people go through is part of self-help, and then we have also got personal development, or what is like your general perspective there?
Well, I think that I think that there's 8 billion people in the world, right? And so
Mhm.
some people are going to need different advice, right, at different times in their life.
Yes.
But what I will say is this: this is the one thing that I wish somebody told me before I got into the whole self-help, personal development thing, and it said this: you're always going to have problems.
Mhm.
So for me, like when I was like really depressed and I was suicidal and I really hit like rock bottom of life, and then as I started to like learn different things, right, and I started to, for example, learn about this thing called the gut microbiome and our nervous system, and I started to learn about neuroscience and how to get out of social anxiety and how to learn social skills and how to retrain your brain, how to rewire your brain. I realized what I found was that my life completely changed. Like I improved so much. Like I was literally unrecognizable, right? But what I also had to learn is that like the reality is that no matter what you do in life, you're still always going to have problems. And what I would say too is that I don't really believe that you can. Obviously, this depends specifically on what problem we're talking about, but I don't really believe that you can 100% like cure or eliminate a problem in your life. I
Mhm.
don't. What
Yeah.
I do believe in though is like, for example, for me, social anxiety controlled my life on any given basis from like 85 to 95%. 85 to 95% of the time, my thoughts, my behavior were controlled by social anxiety. Now it's probably like 5%, 10%,
Mhm.
15%. And so you can make a lot of great progress, but just know that you're always going to have problems. Like there's no such thing, there's no article, there's no motivational video or podcast
Yes.
that you listen to that's going
Mhm.
to fix all of your problems. You're always going to have them. And so I think that it's an answer of both, right? And so I think it just depends on like who we're talking about. Does this person, what issues have they gone through in their life? Is their brain working properly? Are they poor? Are they rich? You know what I mean? And so it just depends if whether it's self-development or self-help or mental health or whatever, all these different buckets on the internet of information. It just depends on yourself. But I think they all have a place, depending on the person, depending on, which time you're in your life. Like, for example, personally for me, I believe that as a human, you can either basically, like, for example, like if your brain breaks, in the same analogy with the
Mhm.
crutches and the crutches and the cast, there's people though who grow up in a life where they have the right parents, they have the right environment, family, social environment, where instead of them just like leaving their brain broken, where like which was what happened to me, a lot of times like they will be able to work incrementally and they'll be able to work on a plan to put their brain in a cast and to start working on themselves to where they're 17, they're 18, they're 19, they're 20 years old, and they're actually confident about life and they're actually very good at
Yeah.
life. And so there's people where if their life goes the right way, which is this is very, very, very rare, by the way, then they can just make incremental movements, right? And that's usually what life is. But there's some people where nobody ever taught them anything like that, which is like me, where I was
Yeah,
just
your
basically
case.
like left alone for a long time. And then all of a sudden I'm 18, I have a rock bottom. But then all of a sudden I start learning things and I change who I am and I just become a different person. But it required for me to hit that rock bottom, right? But for some other people, it doesn't require that, you know? And so for some people, it's just more like positive self-help talk.
Mm-hmm.
But whereas for other people, like for me, and I think it's both, it's about like learning how to like rewire your brain and learning about your psychology and things and like philosophical things, and like learning how your brain works so you can put yourself in a cast and a crutch and then eventually work yourself out of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. In Now talking about your journey, which was like the event or what happened which triggered like this new version of yourself, this new developing version? You said that like the event which triggered all the social anxiety and all that was like the racism you faced when moving to another town or city. And in the same way, which was like the event that triggered the going now upward? Was it like this month of being in depression?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it was just a combination of things. I think it was, I think number one was like the fact that I started to realize that money isn't going to solve my problems,
Hmm.
right? And that's what happens. Like there's an article that I wrote that you can read if you Google. I think it's called "Why Success Itself is the Ultimate Trap." So if you Google that, my article should come up first. But basically, what I talk about is like in life, you're born, and then you basically have a goal of where you're trying to get to. And for some people, it could be a conscious goal. You know this goal. For some other people, it's an unconscious goal, which means that your society, your family, your culture kind of set it for you, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so usually that's what happens. And so what happens is a lot of times you reach that goal eventually, you reach that level of success. And then what happens is you realize it's actually not what you want. You actually realize that it's not the version of success, right? And so that's often what happens. And then there's a process and there's a journey of trying to like retrace your steps and trying to find yourself and being like, okay, what actually does make me happy? I know people who like I've interviewed on my podcast who they told me like once they got like $800 million in their bank account, they were literally so depressed and they almost killed themselves. And so this is a very common thing that happens a lot of times, especially with successful people. And so when it comes to like what happened for me, it was a combination of me understanding like I'm not actually successful. I don't know what it means. And what happens is when you reach that level of success, that was like your entire plan. That was your entire goal. And you
Hmm.
didn't get what you want. And then now you're like, wait, what? What am I supposed to do now? Right. And so there's like this confusion that happens. And I think there was that. And then I think the other thing too was it was just social anxiety. And so, like, for example, a lot of the times, like, there's kids who grow up shy, introverted, and that's not necessarily a problem. But what happens is, when they're 9, 10, 11 years old, they experience an event, something like that. And by the way, a lot of us, we forget about that event that happened to us. It's a very common process. Like if you asked me when I was 18, hey Mark, did you ever face racism? Did anything happen to you? I'd be like, no, nothing happened. Like, what are you talking about? And so a lot of times, like our brains actually suppress that memory, especially if it's dark. It's a very common thing in human psychology. But what I learned was, you know, like for me, one of the biggest things was uh, I never, um, I never really had an understanding of health. And what I meant by that is like for me, my concept of health was like, you know, like if you eat too much food, you're gonna gain too much weight and you're gonna become fat, and you don't want to be fat because people aren't gonna love you. And so that for me was my understanding of health. But what happened was when I was in college, I started to eat a lot of junk food, right? And all of a sudden, I became obese. I gained like 75 pounds. And what happened was, uh, I learned about this thing called the gut microbiome. Have you ever heard of this thing called the gut microbiome?
No, 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 no. Well,
Okay.
I think I have heard, but don't really know where it is.
Okay. So basically, uh, all humans, we have this thing between our intestines and our stomachs called the gut microbiome. And this is like our gut, like you hear that a lot. And this is where trillions of bacteria sort of exist in symbiosis with humans, and they digest our food, right? And it has bacteria, it has fungi, it has viruses, all these living things. And I mean, we all saw how like last year and even this year, like with COVID, how a little single celled virus could completely change the world. And so we have
For sure.
trillions of bacteria in our gut. And these bacteria, they help us do things, right? And so when you eat food, these bacteria, they eat the food first, and then they produce the chemicals and what's necessary for your body to function properly. Like, for example, like, did you know that humans can't actually digest plants? We actually can't digest fiber. Our gut eats the plants, it eats the fiber, and then it creates good bacteria or sometimes bad bacteria that then our stomach can digest and eat. And so this does all kinds of things. And for example, like they have shown that we have this thing in our brains called neurotransmitters, right?
Yeah.
And you've heard of neurotransmitters. There's many forms of neurotransmitters, and these basically serve as like functions for our brain, right? So there's a neurotransmitter for how you feel the emotion of love and connection with other people. And there's this other neurotransmitter called serotonin. And serotonin, I don't know, it looked like you're about to say something.
No. I mean, I think I'm kind of getting what you will say now, but yeah, I want you to finish.
Yeah, and so serotonin, it's a very complex neurotransmitter, but basically it does things from it regulates our mood, how we feel, to how we sleep, to how we function in social groups. And so, for example, like for me, someone who looks at social anxiety, serotonin is a very, very important neurotransmitter for your brain. Like it literally helps create your entire life. It helps create your experience of life. And what they found is that, there's this new emerging field of science called nutritional psychiatry. And the reason why is because they found that 90% of serotonin, this neurotransmitter, is actually not in our brain. Most of it is actually in our gut microbiome, all those bacteria that I talked about before. And like, for example, there's a nerve, a nerve that connects from your brain to your gut directly called the vagus nerve. And basically what they found is that the two major causes of problems to your gut microbiome is chronic stress that's usually caused due to a traumatic event, which is what we talked about, of your brain breaking and experiencing something that harms you a lot. And the number two is the food that you eat each and every single day. And so what I learned for me is like when I was eating terrible food in college, and the chapter in which I talk about this in my book, it's called First My Gut Broke and Then My Brain Broke, right? And I talk about the only time in my life where I was ever seriously depressed and suicidal also happened to be the time where I started to eat a lot of junk food and I became obese. And now we know that there is a direct connection between how the food that you eat and your state of mental health, because what your food eats is like, when you put food in your mouth, you don't just eat it just to make yourself not hungry. That food gets broken down by your gut microbiome, and it literally controls your neurotransmitters, which literally creates your experience of life itself. And so that was one of the biggest things that I learned. And, there's no such thing as a universal healthy diet. There's no such thing as everybody should be eating the same food. But one of the biggest foundational principles that we can say is that no human being should be eating heavily processed foods, chips, candies, things like that come in bags and boxes. And if you buy a food at the grocery store and you look at the ingredients list and you look at an ingredient that you don't understand, It's not because you're stupid. It's because that's an artificial ingredient that's not good for you. And the
Yeah.
issue is
Mhm.
that this is happening in all the modern countries. That's why we all have diabetes and heart disease and dementia. But the interesting part about it is like if you look at, for example, developing countries, and then you look at like where they're getting their food from, people in developing countries are actually also starting to get other kinds of diseases like heart disease, like dementia, like diabetes, like mental health problems, because we're giving them our food from America and it's making them sick physically and also mentally. And this is something that, especially in America, people don't like to talk about this because everyone is very, very like emotional when it comes to food. And
Mhm.
this is a major, major problem. And I can go more into this, and there's all kinds of science that backs this up. But that's one of the biggest things that I also think that happened to me that really messed up my brain. And so now I know I always eat healthy.
Yes, so the saying of "you are what you eat" is in a certain way true, based on what you said about the how's it called, the microbiome, or
Yeah, yeah,
or
the
the
gut
gut. Oh,
microbiome.
yeah, the gut microbiome. Okay, yeah, yeah, I think I do get what you mean, and I am not sure if Mexico is a developing country or already a developed country, but
I don't
here,
think. I think it's a developed country.
okay, yeah, because here we ain't got no problems of like people starving, but the problems are because of
Right.
obesity and diabetes,
Right.
and
Yeah,
also,
developed country.
yeah, exactly,
That's how you
yeah.
know.
Yeah, and my mom is a nutritionist, and she's
Mhm.
like against sugar, and well, sugar like industrial sugar.
Right.
And I mean, I kind
Smart.
of get what you mean, and also, for example, Tony Robbins talks about this a lot, about like how your yeah, your body works, and how that affects how you feel and how you perform in the world, and how you act. And yeah.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, your mom sounds like a smart lady, and like what I've learned is like there's this myth, and it says that like kids, teenagers should eat whatever they want, and they should focus on eating healthy when they're older. That's literally the worst thing you can say because the reality is like right now your brain is literally in the process of growing. Like you want to start as early as possible, and so kids should literally be eating the healthiest out of all of us. But yeah, I mean it's a major issue, and sugar is the biggest anxiety drug. Like literally, if you want to greatly reduce your anxiety, cut out all kinds of industrial sugar, cut out candy, all these sports drink sodas. Like if you cut those things out, it's going to be a little painful at first. It's going to suck. But once you do, you're going to thank yourself because you're like, for me, when I started to eat healthy, I felt like my brain turned on for the first time in my entire life. And then all of a sudden, the thing about gaining energy is that when you gain energy, you actually see more opportunities of your authentic self coming out in the world because you need to have the energy to be yourself. Like nobody talks about that, but like it requires energy for you to
Mhm.
be your authentic self. And food is the biggest, it's like the easiest thing that you can do like at the bottom of the list to like check off that list, and then you can get into like more complicated things, you know. And so I totally agree.
And so, besides like looking for certain diets that might work for each person, you say that everyone should like try to cut up industrial sugars in order to like
Anything
develop.
industrial, not just sugar,
Mhm.
anything industrial. Like I actually I would rather consume industrial sugar than I would consume artificial chemicals, because I mean if you eat sugar, I mean, there's a lot of different like biological mechanisms that happen. You know, one of them is like when you eat sugar, your blood glucose level
Mhm.
goes up. And the issue, what happens is like if you eat that, you feel good for 5 minutes, but then there's an energy crash, you know, an hour from now. And a lot of the times for some people, when they have that crash in energy, their brain signals an alarm system because it's saying, because our brain runs off glucose largely, it's saying, oh my god, there's an energy depletion, something wrong is happening. And so for some people that may trigger anxiety or depression like symptoms. And so, but what I would say is you remove industrial chemicals, because industrial chemicals can have a bigger effect on people in ways that we don't even know. And like, for example, like one of the great ways to look at this is if you look at Europe, the European Union, and you look at how, like their regulatory body, they look at like their government, how they regulate things. The European Union has banned over like 500 ingredients that are still being used every single day in America and Mexico. And the worst part about it is it's literally the same exact companies. And so, for example, the same company, like I'm not going to mention any names, but the same major corporation that creates the junk food for all over the world, they'll create an American Mexico version, and then they'll create a UK European version, and the European version doesn't have the artificial ingredients, colorings, dyes that have literally been banned, because it's been shown like there's so many different things. Like there's studies that show different chemicals can cause all kinds of things, from behavioral problems to ADHD to violence. Like there's so many different things. And so what I would say is step one is just remove all artificial chemicals, not just sugar. So really anything that comes in a bag, in a box, or when you look at the ingredients list, it has stuff that you don't recognize.
Mm-hmm.
It has things that aren't like natural ingredients, right? And natural food, you want to just be eating stuff that has grown in the ground or has been walking or swimming in underwater or in the ground. That's the most basic way to look at it. And then if you really, 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 really want to be like specific and you have the money, then you can get this thing called the gut microbiome test, which I recommend one from a friend of mine owns a company. His name is Naveen Jain. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's like a billionaire, and he has this company called
No.
Viome,
Uh-huh.
Viome. And what you can do is you can actually get your body tested. And so they actually test it through your poop and through your blood and through your saliva. And they test your bacteria, and they actually know what's happening in your gut. And so I did it, and then that gets like way more hyper specific. Like it literally tells you like, hey, don't eat this food because this can trigger that. Like that's if you want to do it. So yeah, the technology exists. You can, be broad or be specific, but I personally don't agree with what I would say like extreme diets.
Yes.
People, so I think, again, like I think everyone has their own take on it, but I think things that aren't as extreme are better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my grandpa's is a doctor, a medical doctor, and he has some debates with some arguments with my mom about nutrition, and when he
Nice.
yeah yeah it gets interesting. And what he tells her mainly, or just what he tells us, is to have a balanced diet, like to not to cut fruits off
Yeah.
and sugary stuff, but like to have a balance between all things and be aligned with nature, and that might help. And have you heard about Darin Olin?
No.
Well, he's I don't know if he's a nutritionist or what, but he's deep into like nutrition, and he has a concept called superfoods. So I don't know much about it, but I think,
Yeah. Oh
yeah,
yeah.
I think it's like the idea of, okay, what is a superfood between industrial something that has industrial sugar and an apple, and in that case, what gives you more energy in a better way or something like that, the apple is better. And yeah, I actually agree with what you say, and I don't have to
And so
agree
what does your mom
science
say?
about
And so what is
sugar.
your no, like what does your mom argue then with your doctor?
Oh, I mean, with my grandpa,
Yeah.
so because
We don't have to talk about it.
no, yeah, she stands for the idea of like consuming the least sugar possible and increasing a little bit more like fats. And
Oh yeah.
yeah, she follows like many people on Instagram, many
Nice.
nutrition influencers. And what I have heard that they say mostly is like fat was demonized in the last
Oh yeah.
century. Uh-huh. but it is like something which is actually good. And sugar in the last century, mostly after the industrial revolutions, sugar became something like popular and which people wanted to buy, and because of companies such as Coke and Pepsi and all those, and also
Those
because of their
bastards.
size, yeah. And you know, it's just like a hole you can keep diving in, because
Yeah.
yeah, because of money, it's cheaper to buy like a Coke than
Right.
another drink, and that just keeps giving more money to Coke to produce more things and to have this like division between the
And they're funded by
European
the
products.
government.
Yeah,
Like for
yeah.
example, like it's interesting because like I mean, first off, I agree with probably both of them. Like I think that you should have a balanced diet when it comes to all the food groups. When it comes to like having a balanced
hmm
diet of
yeah.
carbohydrates, fat, protein. I personally like what I think is like if you like there's a lot of people who eat junk food in moderation, right? And I'm not a saint, right? Like I definitely sometimes still eat junk food like every once in a while, right? But what I would say is like you can't do it that often. And like I don't do it like every weekend or something like that. I think that's too often because what happens is like the more you eat junk food, the more you're dependent on it. It's like a drug. And what
Yes.
happens is the more you eat junk food, the more regular whole food actually tastes bad. And so, and like that's another thing too. Like I literally remember every single day when I was a kid, literally chugging like two or three sodas,
Uh-huh.
Gatorade, sports drinks, eating bags of candy. And like what I realized is like the reason why I never ate like fruits or vegetables was because the more you do that, you actually desensitize your tongue and your taste buds. And so regular food actually tastes worse. And so if you can eat less junk food, regular food actually tastes way better. And I know it sounds crazy. And like in my book, Screw Being Shy, there's actually a chapter where I talk about there are 10, 11 specific key ingredients, minerals, substances that can specifically help your brain rebuild if you have anxiety, social anxiety. And for example, I talk about like omega-3 fatty acids that you get from fish. I talk about vitamin D, which you largely get from animal products. I talk about potassium, tryptophan, vitamin B1. These are all basically like the basic building blocks that your brain needs to function. And if you don't have those, it's like trying to build a house and you don't have any cement. Right. It's like your brain is like trying to exist. It's like this. Like I spoke at a high school a couple of weeks ago and I told them it's like imagine if someone gives you a Lamborghini, like a $10 million Lamborghini or something, right? And you're driving and it's doing great, but then all of a sudden the Lamborghini stops working, and then you're like, oh, let me just and you're like, oh, what's wrong with the Lamborghini? And then you find out you're on empty. Your gas is empty. You have no more gas. Imagine instead of putting the right kind of gas, the premium fuel, you just load it up with Kool-Aid and Coca-Cola and bread and all these industrialized artificial chemicals and ingredients. And so that's going to destroy your Lamborghini, your car, even if it's the world's best car. And
hmm
so that's the way that I think about it. And yeah, I mean it's a crazy rabbit hole you can get down. And honestly, what I've learned is talking about diet with people is like talking about religion. And like everyone is like I went on someone's podcast. Like I've been on a few people's podcasts where like they just tell me the craziest things. Like someone told me like something like if you eat an animal product, your spirit has to cleanse that individual animal product compared to eating a plant because it's not alive, which like literally doesn't make
yeah.
any kind of sense.
hmm
And so like people will have all kinds of opinions and things. What I would say is just follow the science. And what I would say is that usually looks like eating a decent amount of vegetables, fruits, complex carbohydrates, things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, all these different things. And then, eating, a decent amount of like fat, protein, fish, animal products, meat, things like that. And I think that's the basics. I think anybody who tries to tell you, in my opinion, oh, you should go on this diet or you should go on this, crazy diet. I think that diets are like tools, right? And there is sometimes where you do want to change your diet depending on what you want to do. So for example, for me, I know that I feel the best when I eat a lot of fat. And so for me, it's like if I feel like I need the energy, I'm going to eat a lot of fat. But I also know that's not the best long-term strategy because you also need complex carbohydrates. Think like you need to eat fruits and things like that. And so diet is a tool, but in my opinion, anybody who tries to like tell you something, they're trying to sell you something. And like if you look at the health and wellness industry, it's like quadrupled in size over the years. It's worth billions and billions of dollars, and yet people are getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And so I personally don't really believe in people that tell you like, oh, you have to you have to like go 100% vegan, or you have to do this, or you have to do this detox. That's all BS. Like just study human history and study how humans ate, and you'll realize that we just ate a balance of like animals, plants, all these different things together. And we moved around a lot. We slept, we were outside a lot. That's the big thing too. Like like one of the big things that I found out too is like vitamin D. Vitamin D is so important. I had on my podcast this guy named Dr. Daniel Amen, and he's one of the world's best psychologists, and he's actually Justin Bieber and Demi Lovato and Miley Cyrus's mental health doctor. And so he actually told me when he came on my podcast, he said the one commonality, the one thing in common with every single mental health anxiety issue is a lack of vitamin D. And you get vitamin D from two ways: the sun, or you get it from primarily animal products, except for mushrooms, I think. But it's the most bioavailable in animal products. And the last part is, if you're eating junk food, you're eating sugar, that actually prevents your body from absorbing enough vitamin D. And what they've actually found is, like, for example, like for me, my origin is Egypt, right? Like my ancestors are from Egypt. My parents are from Egypt. Egyptians gave birth to me, but I live in America. I live in the Northeast. And so the sun is out today, but I live in an area in the Northeast of America where a lot of times it's very cold. We get a lot of snow. There's a lot of cloudiness, rain, things like that.
Where are you based?
I live in Boston, Massachusetts. And so if my ancestors, if my DNA has existed in Egypt, which is in the Middle East, hot, the sun is out all day, they've actually done studies that show different people who migrate to different countries that are colder, they need more vitamin D. Whereas if you're someone who grew up in this area for years and like your family has been there, you actually need less vitamin D because your skin cells are used to it. And yet vitamin D is actually one of the most important vitamins because it actually controls your energy and the function of all cells. And so another great tip is like go outside. Like going outside is one of the best things that you can do. And for me, like as an entrepreneur, I'm always busy. And so what I do is like I try to schedule, unless I'm doing a podcast or unless I'm doing like a meeting where I have to be like looking at things on my computer, I always take my meetings outside. Obviously, unless it's like raining or snowing. And what I do is I go for a walk and I just try to spend as much time as I possibly can outside because it's one of the best things that you can do for your brain and all of your neurotransmitters.
And for situations such as, having the pandemic or snow or rain, if it's like, let's say you have like 7 days of snow without stopping. What?
Oh yeah.
And you already have like anxiety problems and even depression. What would you suggest anybody to do in those cases, like to compensate that walk they are missing, like to not to fall into the hole of and hit rock bottom?
Yeah. I mean, first off, what I would say is it's hard. Like we're just getting out of like weeks of like snow, and honestly, it can sometimes get depressing, for sure. But what I would say is this: so one thing that I do is if I can't walk outside, what I'll do is I will get in my car. And again, I don't know if you can accept this advice during a pandemic. I don't know what it's like in your country. In my country, like in the place where I live, it's not that populated. There aren't that many people. And it's relatively safe in terms of COVID. And so what I'll do is I'll get in my car and I'll just drive to like some big area and just walk around. So like I'll literally drive to like the biggest grocery store that's like 10 minutes away from my house. And I'll literally just put in my headphones, listen to like an audiobook or a podcast or sometimes music, and I'll just walk. The second thing that I would say is when it's like that, you need to take vitamin D. And so what I would say is you need to supplement vitamin D. And a lot of times the best case scenario is if you can find a supplement for both omega-3 and vitamin D in the same supplement. That's usually how it works the best because fish have vitamin D and fish also have omega-3. And so I recommend for everybody, unless you're already eating fish daily, I recommend for everyone to take a good supplement for omega-3 and vitamin D. And then what I would say is on top of that, just eat more fish, especially like oily fish like salmon, sardines, eggs, red meat, liver, oysters, shellfish. All these things are very high in vitamin D. And so, yeah, if you live in an area where you can't get the sun, I totally know what it's like. It sucks. Try to go for a walk inside where it's safe, supplement with omega-3 and vitamin D, and then just try your best to eat more foods that I listed that have vitamin D in them.
All right. Then something I was thinking about is that you called
And then
yeah.
I'm so sorry. So the last thing is that so I was in an interview with a very young person who I think this was in May of last year, and she lived in Europe. Okay, and she lived in a country where they literally were not allowed to leave their house. Like there were police like roaming the streets. It wasn't like that in America. I don't know if it was like that in Mexico City, but but basically like she asked me the same question, and I literally told her, I said literally break your screen still, like the windowsill, and literally just stick your head outside for 15 minutes because they've actually done studies that show most of the receptors for vitamin D are actually on your forehead and they're actually on your face. And so I literally told her, if you can't go outside and the sun is there, literally just stick your head out the window for 15 minutes. And so, you got to do what you got to do,
Yes, no, totally. I mean, I haven't had any like anxiety problems, I think, during the pandemic, like any real tough anxiety problems.
And can I tell you something?
Yeah, for sure.
I'm sorry. I want to tell you this because my gut is telling me to tell you this. And I know we're also limited on time. I don't know if you have to go right away. And also,
no.
I have a lot of passion. I have a lot of passion for younger people. This is the thing that I'll also tell you. So there's this thing, there's a I don't know if you've heard of this, but there's a psychological phenomenon that happens. And I don't mean this to upset you or to depress you, but there's a psychological phenomenon that happens basically around when you're 18, 19, where when you're a kid and you're in your childhood, like your brain is pumping you with neurotransmitters. Like remember all those neurotransmitters we talked about? When you're a kid, just naturally speaking, from ages 0 to 18, your brain is pumping you with so many neurotransmitters and all these brain chemicals. And that's, for example, even if you've had a very hard life and you've experienced a lot of pain, that's what a lot of times can make you feel as a kid as if like you don't have any problems and you're just sort of going through it. But what happens is, this is just a natural sort of fact. When you're about 18, 19, a lot of these neurotransmitters that got you through your childhood, just naturally speaking, there is just a natural cutoff point where it just starts to go down and then just flatlines. And so I'm saying that because when I was 15 and you asked me, do I have anxiety? Number one, I would say, I don't even know what anxiety is. I think that's like for depressed people who are like sitting in a dark, bed by themselves, sleeping all day. But what I would also say is like, I thought I didn't have anxiety because I didn't know what it was. And also because my brain was pumping me through. And so a lot of times you reach 18, 19, 20, and then all of a sudden there's what we call like, the end of the childhood dream ends in your mind in reality. And like this can be measured in your brain. And so I'm just saying that because I meet a lot of younger kids who like when they hear this stuff, they're like, oh, well, I don't gotta do whatever. But the reality is that this is going to hit you twice as hard. And I'm so glad that you're on your journey and you're already learning. This is going to hit you twice as hard if you're not doing these things in the first place, right? And so for me, like if you're not already taking care of your brain and you experience, this sort of natural phenomenon when you're 18, 19, 20, you're going to hit rock bottom. And it happens so often. And so I would just say to keep that in mind, because it's like this natural phenomenon of what happens when the end of your childhood and you become an adult, you're 18, 19, 20, and then all of a sudden your brain is going to go down. And all of a sudden, like there's this quote that says, once you know the rules of life change. And so a lot of the times that's often what can happen in life. And so the best thing that I can say is if you can get into a preventative mindset, a proactive mindset to say to yourself, like, hey, I may not have these issues now, but how can I invest in myself right now so that worst case scenario, 5 to 10 years from now, I'm a better person, I'm a stronger person. I guarantee you that's a great thing. And like, for example, like if you even look at the science, right? They show that, you ever heard of Alzheimer's, dementia? It's a brain disease. This brain disease affects about 3 to 5 million people in America. Okay. And so as junk food increases, this is a bigger issue. They've actually shown studies that show when you're a teenager and when you're in your 20s, that is how dementia starts to begin. And it happens through not going to sleep enough, drinking too much alcohol, and consuming too many junk foods and sugar. And so a lot of these issues that pop up in your life when you're 25, 30, 35, 40, and you're like, oh my God, this is random. These are actually issues that have been bubbling beneath the surface. And so that's what I would just say to you in terms of trying to get into like a preventative mindset. I mean, which you're already doing, but to anybody else listening, because if you can face a problem voluntarily, proactively, it's going to cause you a lot less pain in the long term. You know what I mean? Like you won't have to get to me where like literally your brain breaks and you want to kill your, like what, like, you know what I mean? And so that you want to start these things proactively.
No, I do get what you mean. And again, talking about like my experience during the pandemic, I think that, I do agree with what you say that, I mean, because of the neurotransmitters in my brain, I might not have been conscious about tough things and haven't suffered because of them. But also, I mean, I think my habits and mostly my habits have been like a big part of not having suffered much mentally during the pandemic, because I have got friends from school who are not at all into personal development or anything, and they're like very, very, very depressed. Well, not very depressed, but very anxious. They have been through stages of depression. They want to leave school. I mean, I haven't heard of any friend who has had suicidal thoughts, but still they do not feel happy. And in my case, I have not like experienced that. I think that is because of my morning routine. For example, I wake up like at 6 a.m. I do my bed, I go down, I drink water, I exercise, and I meditate, I read. Then I do my stuff, and in the evening I start like to sort of relax. I start to sort. Thanks, and I start to sort of relax. And again, this has been all because of personal development books, which have guided me through a process to start doing things like this and things like Zoom calls with cool people.
And it's also because of you. It's also because of you. Like personal development exists. Anybody can access it, but it's also because of you, and like the reality is that your future self is going to thank you so much, dude. Like you have no idea, man. Like when you're my age, you're literally going to look back at this interview and you're literally just going to start crying. Like, and like, I guarantee you when you're my age, this looking back at and like seeing how far you've come is going to be the biggest thing that like motivates you. And the other thing too that I can say to you is like, dude, I know, like in terms of what you said about your friends and what you do differently, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I started to experience this when I was like 19. Like, so when I started to change my life and I, went from rock bottom and I started to hustle in all kinds of different ways, And all of a sudden, like, I had different friends that would make fun of me when I was first starting out.
Yes.
They'd be like, "Oh my God, Mark, what you're doing is so stupid. Like, what you're doing is so pointless. Like, you can't change the world. You can't change yourself." And obviously not all of those people, but there's been so many people who were my friends that reach out to me and they say, hey, you know what, Mark? I actually faced the same exact thing that you faced. And I had no idea that anybody else experienced the same problem. And because of your message and just because of who you are as a person, my brain knows that. And it knows, especially if this is someone who you spent a lot of time with and that you've grown up with, you're like, their brain knows that you're just a normal person. And if you've become successful, they can also do the same thing. And so I know so many people where when I first started my journey, they made fun of me. Maybe they were depressed themselves, but then eventually they ask you for help and they ask you for your advice. And so I don't know if you've reached that point yet, but it's interesting, man. Keep going, man.
No,
Keep inspiring people.
it is. I started my personal development journey like properly 3 years ago when I changed from elementary
Damn.
school. When I changed from elementary school to what here we call secondary school. And in my first 2 years, it was like I tried to hide that part of myself. And for example, I
Mm.
remember one day I was reading, well, during a class in which we were supposed like to read the 5 a.m. Club, and all the rest of my friends were reading like other novels and other fiction books. And when the class was finished, I just like hid the book and went to get my backpack to hide the book quickly so no one would ask. And also with my page with the reader lounge, for the first like 8 months, I didn't tell anybody except for one friend who I knew
Mm.
likes personal development. Um, but now most of my friends or all of my friends know like about this part of me, and that has been like great. Not just to focus, yeah, it has been great so that I do not focus on hiding that part, but I can also even help more people. And I have sort of helped other friends, but I don't think I have gotten into like a moment of sort of being a mentor friend or something. I think that you can see the difference between these two worlds, let's call it, like the personal development one and the victimhood one, we could say. But still, that's, for example, a reason of why I do this podcast, like to share these messages to people I love, but also to people who I don't know, but who I know are going through tough times, so that I can in some way help them, as books helped me, and as some mentors have been doing. And yeah, well, is there anything you would like to add to that? Because I want to
Yeah.
go to like another part of. Uh-huh.
Yeah, sure. What I would say too is like what I would say too is like it's I understand what you're saying. I totally agree, but I also think that it's not necessarily victimhood. I think maybe you
Hmm.
could broadly classify it as that. But like for example, like if you happen to be born in a certain like with certain genetics and your parents happen to be in a certain way and you happen to have experienced life in a certain way and you experience trauma in a certain way and your life just is the way it is. Like there's some people who live lives that I can't even imagine. Like there's some people who
Hmm.
are like they were kidnapped when they were 9 years old, and then someone brainwashed them and they're a sex slave and they're in human trial and like that. I can't even imagine that. And so there's people around the world who live completely different lives when they open their eyes from you and I. And one of the biggest things that I've learned is like if you are on a every single basis, every single second in your brain you're experiencing anxiety, you're experiencing chronic pain, your brain is broken, right? And so it has like that pain. A lot of the times you actually lose control of your free will. And so for example, like I think back to who I was And I think like, why didn't I change before? Right. And the reality is I didn't change before because I didn't know you could change. Because when you are constantly surrounded in your head every single second of pain and of agony and of misery and of the world being a dark, evil, scary place, and that's how you're literally seeing it, like when you open your two eyes, then what's going to happen is the next free second that you get to relax, you want to do something that can relieve your pain, right? And so you go eat junk food, you go play video games, right? You go do these things. And a lot of the times, like that, unfortunately, like that's what keeps somebody in a cycle. And so they don't know that they can change. They're in constant pain. They're looking for something to change their pain, but nobody ever taught them how to actually address their pain at a root level and learn different good habits. And so I know for me, like the reason why I didn't change is just because I didn't know you could. And I know that may be hard to understand, but that's the life for a lot of people, you know, and that's why it's not only until someone has an experience of life and they are in life and they experience it and they're like, holy crap, then their perception changes, then their mind changes, and then they start to see, you know, what's possible. Like for me, it only took me literally almost killing myself to realize that, you know, and so that's a big thing too. And I think what happens is there's a lot of, I would say, adults and of people who they grow up and, you know, they've been dealt a bad hand, but they don't use it. They don't use anything to try to transform their pain. And I think the reality is that pain that they don't know how to use gets transformed into what I would call hate and resentment. And you start thinking that all successful people or all happy people are bad people, or they're like that because they just got lucky. That is where I think the real danger lies. Because when you start thinking that way, it's very hard to pull yourself out. And that is really when you do be like the embodiment of like a victim, you know? But the issue is that victims also create other victims. And so that's a big sort of play. And so the world needs people like you and I to talk about this stuff. And you know, there's like that people say like if you don't need a reason to be upset or to be angry at the world, then why do you need a reason to be happy? Right. And so like you know, of course that's a little simplistic, but yeah, it's interesting. I'm curious. What do you think about that?
No, yeah, well, first of all, I chose the world victimhood because that was the first one which came to my mind. But I do get what you mean about people who, because of their circumstances at a young age, went through very, very, very tough times we cannot even imagine, and we cannot like call them victims necessarily because that's just the way it was for them. Well, maybe they were actually victims. Sorry.
Right.
Uh-huh. Yeah, they actually were victims, and other people who, after going through this cycle, just decide to stay through big. They decide to stay as a victim. So I think it's mostly about when you bring the consciousness about your situation, getting to know what you choose, like to keep acting as a victim after you might have overcome that stage. And yeah, and right now I am talking about like when you already have overcome the tough part. So acting as a victim when you have already overcome that part is your decision, but so is the other the other side of the spectrum. And actually this is something I wanted to ask you. So um I think somewhere, I don't know if it was on your Instagram, I read something you say about responsibility, and that being responsible is having like the ability to respond. I would just like you to like get deeper into that. How does that
Yeah.
relate also to this part of victimhood?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. So I remember I remember in 2016 where I was like really just trying to find out like what was happening and what I was doing in life. And um, I remember it was like this weird period where like I was sort of doing the self-development stuff, but not really. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
I was like kind of half and half. Like I would like like I would try to eat healthy, but then all of a sudden like I'd go to a party and drink a ton of alcohol and do God knows what. And so I was like kind of half and half. And I remember like coming back from I was in college at that time and I was coming back from class. And I remember I like took a nap in the middle of the day. And I remember waking up. And I remember being in like this half dream, half awake state.
Mm-hmm.
And like I don't know what I was dreaming about, but my thoughts were like very cloudy. Right? I was just starting to wake up. And I started to just get this feeling that if I didn't commit and if I didn't dedicate myself truly, then I would never ever be able to progress in my life. And I would be one of those people that, 5 years would pass and I would say, okay, then I'll start my self-development journey. And then another 10 years passed and then like, oh, then I'll start it. And then 15 years would pass and I'd start it. And so I just like got this feeling where I was like, I have to do something right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I had no idea what to do. Right. And so basically what I did is like, I put on my shoes and I went outside my dorm and I walked to Target. I don't know if you guys have a Target in Mexico.
No, we don't have it.
It's basically like Walmart.
Yeah, like
Walmart. You know
Walmart.
Walmart, like it's just like a store that just sells everything, like it's a general store.
Yeah.
And so I'm walking there, and like I start to think to myself like I'm gonna buy like a whiteboard and a journal. And at this time, I never wrote like my thoughts down. Like I never even started that process. And so I remember like going on this walk, and I remember this walk was literally like it literally became like a spiritual experience. I don't know how else to describe it. But like literally I remember walking, and again like I'm still like waking up, so I'm like what's happening? And all of a sudden like I just started thinking about like all the bad things in my life and all the good things in my life. And I basically started to realize that like none of the bad things that happened. Okay, I shouldn't say none of the bad things. I should say most of the bad things that happened to me. Most of them happened to me, and it wasn't my fault, right? And I think a lot of the times, like we confuse responsibility or like this whole victimhood stuff with somebody's fault. Like, oh, it's his fault or it's her fault for this happening. I don't really believe in that conversation. I don't really think that fault matters. I don't really think it's an important detail. What it is about your responsibility, right? And so for me, it's like, it's not my fault that I faced racism. It's not my fault that I experienced different health issues. It's not my fault that these things happened to me. But the reality is whether I like it or not, I am responsible for whatever that event created in me and for who I am right now. And I just started to realize like I'm actually responsible for who I am, for all the bad things that have happened to me, but then also all the good things that have happened to me in my life. And really what I just started to understand is like once you start to take responsibility and you just start to say like, you know what, I'm no longer like this passenger in the back of a bus by my society, by my school system, by my parents, by my culture. I'm actually going to take responsibility for who I am. And I'm going to, take ownership of who I am. Right. And like I talk about this and I'm like, how can you control something that you don't own? You can't control something that you don't own. And a lot of us are walking around here like we don't actually own ourselves. We walk around here like we're, and it seems weird, but we can kind of do that if we don't take responsibility. And a great like euphemism for this is responsibility, response able. You're able to respond in life. And the way that I think about it is like, it's also about taking responsibility for who you are in life and addressing the bad things about life. And what I mean by that is like when you sign up for a social media account, or if you sign up for a game, right, and you fill out your information, Mark Metry And then it asks you, hey, do you want to agree to the terms of service? Do you want to check the terms? Do you agree, right? To like the legal aspect. And the reality is that's exactly how life works. But nobody ever asks us to sign the agreement. And this is the
Mhm.
agreement of life. You're going to die. That's the agreement. Like you're born and you're going to die. So
Mhm.
many of us have never even thought about our death, right? And the reality is if you've never thought about your death, you've probably also never thought about the extremely limited time that you have, right? And, Steve Jobs has this quote and it says, life's best invention is death. Because when you realize that one day you're going to die, you're like, oh, I have nothing to lose. And so that's one aspect of it. But then also, like, there's terms of life when it comes to like, hey, there's cause and effect. If you have good morals, good ethics, and you try to do something right, then life is probably going to send you something right. It's not guaranteed. But then also, if you do something bad, you're probably going
Mhm.
to get something bad in return, right? And so there's like these very basic principles of life, right? Like you have to take care of your body. And so if you don't agree with those, and the way that you agree to those terms is by taking responsibility, you will probably never be able to control your life. Now, however, now that I said what I said, there's also a flip side to this. And there's also people who actually take too much responsibility. They actually spend all their time and they're like, you know
Yeah.
what? When my parents divorced, it was actually my fault. I'm actually responsible for that. And so I actually see this more often in girls, generally speaking, than men. And so that's an interesting observation. But yeah, there's a people in a minority who they actually take too much responsibility. And what I would say to them is you need to again get clear on what does fault mean versus responsibility, your fault, victimhood versus responsibility, which actually has nothing to do with being a victim because it's saying like it doesn't matter what happened, it doesn't matter whether you like it or not, you have to own your stuff. And the issue is like if you go your entire life and you don't own up to your mistakes and you don't own up to like cause and effect, then you never learn and you never become self-aware about who you actually are. And so, yeah, I mean, I like in my book, there's like I have like a whole subsection, about this, about taking responsibility, and so it's very, very important.
Okay, I'm gonna read your book this month. But
It's also on
okay.
Audible too.
Oh, okay, cool.
It's an audiobook.
All right. So if you own things, you then are have you then have the responsibility. You have the ability to respond to them, and you can control them. Right? Is that sort of how it works, or
So
how?
basically what I'm saying is like if you don't make that understanding of like, hey, I'm responsible, for example, for my health. But for example, you say like, oh, I'm just gonna go to the doctor and then they're just gonna like tell me what I have to
Mhm.
do, and then I'm gonna like just be whatever, and I'm just gonna be a passenger, versus realizing that like basically nobody's coming to save you. And
Mhm.
it's the idea of like taking ownership and responsibility of like at the end of the day it's your body, like at the end of the day you do what you're going to do to your body that's then going to control your health. And so it's almost like this decision of like outsourcing your health to like an idea versus to be like, oh wait, no, like I'm actually my own CEO of my health. I control what goes in my body, I control what I do. I'm not just going to leave it up to a doctor, for example. And so that's an example. Another one too is like education, right? Education is the biggest one where like you see people who they go into the schooling system and they're smart, and it's actually not because they're smart, it's actually just because they can just follow directions and memorize things.
Mhm.
And then they get out of school and they don't learn anything. That's
Mhm.
because they haven't taken responsibility for their education. Where someone like for me, for example, I got terrible grades. I almost failed out of school, but I never stopped learning ever since I got out of school. And so I took responsibility for my own education. And I said, I'm not going to wait for a teacher, a professor to teach me this. I'm going to go find it myself, because at the end of the day, like no government agency, no sports team, no political organization is going to come save you. Like you have to do it to yourself.
Mhm. I mean, it's interesting. Like, mm, when you get to the point where you already know you are able to take the responsibility, in your case, for example, when you came into the point where you knew you can change, it's like interesting to see that mm, there are many people who maybe do not change. Do you think
Yeah,
why do you think that
that's
why
a
do
that's a
you
great
think that
question.
happens?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So I think it's complicated, but I think personally for me, like, so one of the things of like when I was suicidal and I was in my dark period. So like when I was going through that moment, I had no idea like what I was going through. Like I literally had no idea. It was only until thinking about it later. But one of the things that I did realize looking back was I remember like one night it was like 3 a.m. and I came back and I went to my bathroom. And I went to my bathroom and like my bathroom has like this big mirror. And I looked at myself in the mirror, right? And I basically just like looked at myself, direct eye contact. And it was like this is when I was suicidal. And I just like looked at myself and I was like, wait, who am I? And it was this time where I was in what I would call the present moment. Okay. Do you know what the present moment is? And so what I mean is like this. So when you study the brain, you realize that our brains have this network of like shifting gears, like a car, like from drive to park. And so your brain has this mode where it's called the default mode. And the default mode, this is basically like, this is how your brain is moving, thinking, feeling when you don't even think about how you're moving, thinking, breathing. And this is like what happens like, when you're driving a car, right? Or like you're in the car and you're driving or you're doing whatever, and then you get to your destination and then you're like, oh my god, what just happened?
Hmm.
And like you kind of like forget, right? And so your brain was in the default mode, you just sort of forget about life. And so when you when it comes to like mental health, when you are someone who's experienced a lot of trauma, anxiety, your brain is mostly all in the default mode. And so people don't actually know that they are in control of their own consciousness.
Hmm.
And so I know that seems crazy, but a lot of the times, like, then there's a different mode of your brain, which is the active mode. That's what happens when you're in the present moment. Like right now,
Yeah. Hmm.
I'm in the present moment, right? I don't know if you are, you could not be, you could
No,
maybe
yeah.
be. But when you're in the present moment, a lot of the times, if you have had mental health problems, it's much harder for you to be in the present moment in general because the present moment is painful
Mm.
for like social anxiety, a lot of other people. And so what happens is you usually don't you never experience your life in the present moment unless you experience something that all of a sudden like awakens you.
Mhm.
You're like, wait, what? It like shifts your state of mind. And so I say that because when I was looking at myself in the mirror, when I was at rock bottom, I was in the present moment at that time. And this is the thing. I didn't even know that I was depressed or I was suicidal. I didn't even know what I was doing. But one of the things that I did realize was all of a sudden my pants seemed very tight. They seemed very fit on me. And I remember like putting a finger down my pants and like on my waist and being like, wow, like I can't, like my pants shrunk. And then all of a sudden in that moment, looking at myself in the mirror and then realizing that all of a sudden I gained all this weight and
Mhm.
I was obese. And so I say that story because a lot of the times in life, there's many layers to life. There's what's happening at a mental layer that you may be aware of, you may not be aware of. There's stuff that's happening at an emotional layer. There's things that are happening at a spiritual layer. And there's things that are happening at a physical layer. And usually you can see what's happening at a physical layer, right? And so I realized that I was like overweight. And so my brain at that time when I was young, I could only detect the physical layer of reality and of life itself. And that for me, the only problem that I was aware of was, hey Mark, you're fat, go lose weight. And so for me, I remember going on this process of losing weight and stuff, and like I had told you, once I started to eat a healthy diet, it felt like my brain turned on.
Mhm.
But I remember in 2016, after like eating healthy and then losing a lot of my like all of the weight, I remember um going to my second year of college, to the beginning, and I remember moving in on the first day with all my friends. And I remember my friend opened the door And this is a friend who like I lived with for years, and he saw me at my lowest point, and he saw me when I was like over 200 pounds. And he opened the door, and he was like, "Oh my god!" And I hadn't seen him for months. And he was like, "What the?" He was like, "Who are you, bro?" And then another friend of mine, he came in and said the same thing. And I remember like realizing like, what? And I remember like going to my room and looking at myself in the mirror and like just feeling like the sense of happiness. And the sense of happiness, it wasn't because like my friends were like, "Oh, what happened?" But it was a sense of happiness of like, I could only detect that there was a physical problem in my life. And so I approached it through the physical layer. I lost weight. But then I remember looking at myself in the mirror and seeing like how I had lost the weight and then being in the present moment in that moment and being like, Mark, you set your mind to something and then you did it and then you saw a real world result of your reality. And honestly, when that happened, that was probably the first time in my entire life where I actually consciously realized that you could actually change your life. Like before then, I never even like knew that personal development, that self-improvement was even a thing. Like it just never occurred to me. And so when I saw that change in myself physically, I was like, wow. And then all of a sudden, I just threw my glass out. And then all of a sudden I
Yeah.
just started to realize all these things that had happened. That's all right.
Hmm. I mean, it like makes me think about many things because I do
Good.
have seen. I have got a friend who, like, when he has a big realization, he just like starts to jump and shout, and he's also into personal development.
Nice.
And yeah, a couple of weeks ago probably, or days, so we do weekly masterminds, and in
Nice.
one of these masterminds he had this moment of like the realization of all his change. It's I like related to what you have just said of your story, because based on what he told us, so when he what he told me and my other friend, he had been like changing without being conscious, without being in the present moment and noticing what he was doing and what he had gone through. But in that moment in the mastermind, he just like felt in peace, but also like with space between what he was like watching, between his consciousness and between what was happening between he in the transformation he already experienced. Have you read A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle?
No.
I suggest you read it because it's like about spirituality.
Hmm.
But I can say like two things which I relate a lot to this conversation. The first one is that he talks about enlightenment and about going from a place of attachment to things to a place of consciousness. And what he says is that like enlightenment, you don't control, you do not control when enlightenment happen. Yeah, you do not control when enlightenment happens. So if you have got a spark which life gives you, then you can like own it and start to have enlightenment. And I think that's sort of what happens, which is that many people who are right now depressed do not know that and cannot like consciously say, oh, okay, I'm gonna read this because it's gonna teach me this, and I will know that I
Right.
can control things. But it's life that gives them the lesson. It's life which gave you the lesson, which then you chose to own and to make a catalyst for your change. And I think that's pretty interesting. And the other part is about consciousness, about being in the present moment, and is basically about this, about bringing the awareness, the presence into all of what you do, so that then you can also notice like the change you are creating and the change being created. And he says that's like the new your new life purpose. But still, those two things, the enlightenment part and the presence thing, are like two big things which I can relate to this. And I also wanted to ask you, so earlier you said that sugar can be like a drug, but also
Mhm.
like social media. If you I spent like
Anything.
maybe, yeah, I spent like 5 hours on Instagram like 8 months ago. Yeah, that's a lot.
A
And
day?
yeah, per day. And
Yeah.
I didn't even realize that. But that in that stage I was already in the personal development and reading many books and everything. But still, when the new software update came, it included like screen time part, and because of that I like noticed that I was spending 8 or 9 hours per day in my phone, and most of those hours were just like losing time basically. But then, because I noticed that, and because I don't know, I brought presence into that moment, I can really remember. Then I started to make a change, and right now my screen time is maybe like 3 hours per day or something. But what I wanted to ask you is like, how do you think this drug, so social media, affects like mental health issues?
I mean, definitely a lot.
Hmm.
Um, but
Yeah,
I think
just mhm.
were you gonna say something?
No, yeah, I was just gonna say that I think also a part of social media is, for example, Instagram, a part which has happened to me like a couple of times through my life, is that you start to compare yourself to the perfect lives of others shown on Instagram. But go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that sugar is a drug. I really think that anything can be a drug, and I think that there are some drugs that are better than others. But I think in terms of social media, and also I definitely have to start wrapping up here soon.
Yeah,
But
yeah, sure,
in
sure.
terms of social media, we as humans, like, we have a necessary like vitamin that we have to have, and that's being social, right? And so I think what social media has done is it's taken that human need for social connectivity and it's gamified it in a way where it can give somebody, someone in their pocket at their home in their bed, unlimited like power, and with power comes responsibility. And so
Hmm.
I think that in a lot of ways social media is not necessarily the root problem like a lot of people think it is. I think it's just a drug, but it, like, if someone doesn't have their drug, they're going to go to something else. And so I think a lot of the times, like, social media is just the most acceptable drug because everyone has a phone. Like, you don't need to buy
Hmm.
drugs, you don't need to do something crazy. Everyone has a phone, and so it's the drug that is the easiest, most accessible for everybody in the world. But I don't actually think it's the problem. And like, for example, like, I did, like, because I grew up with social anxiety, my brain was already comparing me to everybody else in school on automatically. Um and so yeah, I don't think it's the root cause, but I definitely think social media could be a positive, it can be a negative. And so I just think you need to check it with yourself and take responsibility for it, and then realize what you need to do. And yeah, man, I just want to say too, like, I appreciate everything that you've done and who you are.
Thank
And
you.
if I
Yeah.
can help you in any way, please definitely let me know. And yeah, I mean, as we close off here, I mean, one thing that I would want to give a shout out to is I have an email newsletter that I've really been working on, where people, if they go to like my Instagram bio or something, it should be the link in my bio, and they can basically go there and put in their email. And basically what I do is I just send out like articles and emails on a weekly basis all about like mental health and the journey. And that's a great way for just people in general, if they're interested, to just stay in contact
Yeah, for sure.
with
For
me.
people listening, definitely do. And I will subscribe to one last question I always ask is, well, my podcast is called The Transformation Journey. And this conversation has been mostly about transformation, about transforming these things we have been talking about, which are based on your journey. And so I want to ask, what is like your definition of transformation, and how do you approach transformation?
That's a great question. So I think that I look at the laws of the universe, And one of the laws of the universe is that energy is constantly in motion, right? And so if you look at right now, all of the rivers, all of the waterfalls in the world, the water is always flowing, right? Everything is constantly moving. The animals are moving, everything. And so for me, my goal is I have to keep up with that energy motion. And I think that if you don't and you try to hold on to things that you know are going to disappear, then you get stuck in the past. And that's how you don't move into. And so for me, I think it's just a matter of, working on what you need to work on. And for everyone that looks different, like honestly, for right now, I'm finding myself doing less, self-development, personal development stuff, because I find that there's a difference between working on your life versus actually being in the present moment and enjoying your life, And before in my life, when I was your age, I could never enjoy my life because I needed self-development. I needed to get my brain. And so over these last 5-6 years, I've been doing self-development. I've been working on myself. But now I'm at a spot where, yeah, working on yourself is cool, but it's also about enjoying yourself too. And so that's also another part of the process that I've been trying to learn. And so I think it's constantly just trying to learn all the time and trying to figure out what your character in the world best needs. And that could look different for everybody.
Okay. I love that, and I think it's a great way to wrap up. And well, do you want to mention where can people also find you, and what's your Instagram? And
yeah, just my name, Mark Metry. Mark Metry, just my first and last name, and you can Google me. And yeah, that email newsletter is the best place where you can get a response from me.
Perfect. Well, Mark, thank you so much for coming on. It really was a pleasure, and I will. Well, I always listen again to my conversations for the podcast, but
nice.
I will have to listen to this one like 2 times or 3 times to really internalize all the concepts, because there were many mind blowing lessons.